Hi, everyone out there. My name is Michael Spector. I'm an adjunct professor of bioengineering and a staff writer at The New Yorker, where I'm lucky enough to have as one of my most esteemed colleagues, Larissa MacFarquhar. I actually looked at my date book this morning, and 1 year ago today, I introduced Larissa to a luncheon as a guest at the Knight Hennessy Scholars program in the faculty lounge back in the days when we got together in human form. It seems like a really long year. And during this year, the issues that Larissa has always addressed, those murky borderlands between ethical norms and needs for society, have never been more important. She has locked onto the idea of sort of trying to figure out whether challenge vaccine trials are morally justified, required, somewhere in between. And nothing could be more important because this particular vaccine, the two vaccines that have been approved, we knew they worked really quickly. And the big question has been, how do you get them to be safe and effective in such a way that we can give them to millions of people rapidly? And that has always been difficult. And a challenge trial is an answer. There will have to be others as well, I think. But nobody is better at discussing these issues than Larissa, or asking the questions that she's about to ask of the brave and interesting people who participated in this trial. So I'm going to turn it over to Larissa with a great deal of excitement and pleasure, and welcome you all to this terrific meeting.
Hi, thank you very much, Michael. And I wish we were all together in person. May it come again soon that we are. And yeah, so I wanted to do this panel in part because I think probably most of you, if not all of you, have spent the past year trying to do anything to avoid being exposed to COVID-19. And you may be here just out of sheer curiosity. Who are these weird creatures who are volunteering to be exposed on purpose? And if we have succeeded in this panel, by the end, it will make perfect sense to you. So let's hope we can do that. And I'm going to introduce them individually, of course, but before I do that, I should say that what unites them all is that they all are volunteers with an organization called One Day Sooner. Which was formed last spring to recruit volunteers for human challenge trials and to speed up the development of the COVID-19 vaccine. And it has done this with astounding success. So far, there are nearly 40,000 people who have volunteered from more than 166 countries to be injected with COVID-19. And another thing you may be wondering is we already have at least two vaccines that have proven to be really effective. So is this any longer necessary to have any further trials? Sadly, the answer is yes, because there is nowhere near enough supply of the current vaccines, and for various technical reasons, other vaccines may be needed to vaccinate, not just the countries like US, UK, Canada that have bought up a lot of the doses already, but the rest of the world as well. So I just want to, before I introduce everybody and before we begin, I just want to make sure that everyone understands what a human challenge trial is. So how they differ from conventional trials. In a conventional vaccine trial, what happens is you assemble thousands and thousands and thousands of people. You give half of them the vaccine candidate, you give the other half the placebo, and then you send them out to continue their lives as usual. And in the course of living their lives, some people will be exposed, some people won't. And after months and months, you evaluate who has gotten the disease and who hasn't, and that gives you a sense of how effective the vaccine is. And as Michael mentioned, this is a very long process. The Moderna vaccine was developed by last February 24th, but it took months and months and months before it was ready to be injected in people's arms. Human challenge trials can greatly speed up this process by, instead of waiting months for thousands of people to see if they get infected just by happenstance, what happens is you get a very small group, just maybe a couple dozen of people. You give a vaccine candidate, wait for it to take effect, and then inject them with COVID on purpose, so you know for sure they have been exposed, and see whether the vaccine candidate protects them. And that way you can learn very, very quickly, at least preliminarily, whether it is effective or not. You can get rid of the ones that are not infected. And even, in a situation that we are in, even one day speeded up can make a huge number of lives difference, hence the name One Day Sooner. But because COVID-19 is new and deadly, this obviously poses grave risks to volunteers, even young, healthy ones, like the 4 you see here, and everyone who has a chance of being accepted is young and healthy. And so for that reason, a lot of researchers are opposed to human challenge trials with COVID-19. They think they should not take place, and we'll get into that later. Okay, so I now want to introduce people one by one. I don't know the order they appear on your screen, but Danica Marcos, I will start with. She was born in the Philippines, but she moved to London. Oh my God, my dog is here. She moved to London with her family when she was very young. She graduated from Lancaster University in 2019 with a degree in PPE, which she explained to me is not the medical equipment, but stands for Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. She is now the Director of Music for the Catholic parishes of Borehamwood near London. She is also the subcommittee advisor on the London homelessness crisis for an organization called Justice and Peace. Then Eric Jeanneret Floyd is a Stanford undergraduate studying physics and philosophy. He is also involved in student government and student activism. Before starting college, he worked as a professional actor with credits including HBO's Ballers, ABC's Days of Our Lives, and NBC Universal's Versus, as well as several feature films and theatrical productions. He's a regular supporter of Deworm the World initiative, and he recently became involved with the broader effective altruism community and is currently working with the Center for Effective Altruism on student outreach and diversity-minded community building. And he lives and is calling us now from Cleveland, Ohio, or he grew up in Cleveland and is there now. Zachariah Kafuko, please. Zachariah is a molecular biochemist. He also hosts Science Bench, which is a radio program on topics in science and mathematics. He was a 2017 recipient of the Mandela Washington Fellowship, which is given by the Young African Leaders Initiative. Before he became involved with One Day Sooner, he taught orphan children and has also worked as a public health educator for the organization Water for African Cities. He heads the African chapter of One Day Sooner and lives in Victoria in the Seychelles, which means, by the way, that it's extremely late at night for him, and we're very grateful that he he agreed to join us. And lastly, Sean McPartlin is a graduate student in philosophy at Oxford University. And before he came to Oxford, he was a co-founder of the organization Injected. Okay, so I just want to start with a little scene setting. Not that anyone here needs education as to what the past year has been like, but just specifically for you all. Danica, I want to start with you. Where were you when the lockdown started in mid-March? And could you tell us a bit about what your life looked like for the next few months and how COVID affected you and your family?
So last year, around March, when the lockdown hit in the UK, I was living at my parents' house, recently graduated student trying to get a job. As you can imagine, the job market is still horrendous. So it's been an uphill battle again. But as we were locked down, because my mum is diabetic, we were trying our best to limit the exposure that she has to the virus, to the point that me and my father are actually quite paranoid about just going for a run or doing our little doing a little exercise per day. We didn't want to do that either. So for the first 2, 3, 4 months, I was confined to the four walls of my house. But I realized as time was going past there is no way that this virus is just going to disappear and it will not just go back to normal. So I realized I needed to leave the house, so I wouldn't expose my mum. I would need to go and try to build my life even whilst the world is falling apart, and try to get a job, try to volunteer, at least try to help out. So I moved in with my boyfriend and his family, who was so kindly letting me stay. And I started volunteering in the local homeless service. So each week I'd go about twice a week and we'd give food. And I think that sort of thing, it's interesting as everyone is struggling right now, and to see other people who have no home, who cannot hide from the virus, cannot stay home, to be able to help them and provide them food is something that I felt like I needed to do, that I wanted to do, because looking around, everyone's struggling right now. I wanted to do the best I can to put as much good as I can during this time.
Yeah. Eric, what about you? Where were you in March, and how did COVID change what you thought was going to happen in the course of your year?
I was living in Los Angeles in March on what was supposed to be a very temporary basis. I'd been in college in the Bay Area the previous fall and was planning on going back in the spring, but those first 3 months of the year or so are what's called pilot season in the film industry. And so I'd taken what I thought was the quarter off to be around for that. Obviously things changed. You know, what started off as a quarter off is now a year and counting. But I was lucky that the day that the first shelter-in-place orders were put out in California happened to be my birthday. And I had made plans to drive up to the Bay Area for the weekend to spend my birthday with my girlfriend and her family. And so when shelter-in-place started, I turned to them and said, "Hey, I might be staying a little bit longer. Is that okay?" And ended up being able to spend most of 2020 with their family rather than in LA, where I don't really have relatives, and it would have been, I think, a tough time to be alone. So I was lucky in that respect, but I ultimately decided that it wasn't right for me to go back to school and try online college. I thought, maybe I can spend this year focusing on some other interests I have, namely, altruism and seeing if I can help out in other ways and be useful, and then think about going back to school once we are able to be in person again, since that's so much of what I love about being in college. And so it's been a cool year to explore some different interests for me, but certainly not as expected.
Zachariah, as I said, you live in the Seychelles, and the Seychelles acted very aggressively, very early to stop the spread of the virus. And it's done an amazingly good job in terms of controlling its spread. But as you have told me, the economic consequences have been very severe. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about what the year in COVID looks like in Victoria.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So I remember very well, I think it was on March 8th when we began to report our first cases in the country. And every one of us was in a panic. By the time the total number of cases in the country reached 11, the government decided to close down the country. Basically, restrictions came into place, so movement was restricted, only essential services remained. And effectively, it also translated into the closing of the airport. Now, as you may know, the Seychelles is a country that relies heavily on tourism. About 70% of the country's earnings come from tourism. So the closing of the airport, the borders, meant that the much needed income could no longer come in, meaning that the hotels, the guest houses, the restaurants that survived to sustain this tourism industry could no longer function as expected. And the devastation started from there. And though, as you mentioned, the government did take very aggressive steps to try and mitigate this. And I think the general citizenry was very cooperative. But more to the point, the government, because of the situation, decided that all those that were formerly employed, whether expatriate or local, they were going to be put on government payroll, meaning even if you're working for a private sector, because of the close down, the business is not operating. So the government took over the paying of salaries for basically all the people who are in formal employment. And I think this is something that helped to reduce the negative consequences of the pandemic. But the social impact that the pandemic had on the country, it still has. Even now, you can feel it. People are forced to get into lockdowns against what they probably wish they could have been doing. So it took its toll. And even now, as the situation is now, many businesses are still closed down. Many people have lost their investments because they invested at a very unfortunate time, so to speak. And of course, recently the numbers have been increasing. And unfortunately, we recorded our first death since the pandemic started just this month. So it's a sad reality for a country. But if I was to describe this year for this country, I would say it's been a year of challenges, but also a year where we saw what really matters in life.
Mm-hmm. Sean, well, maybe not by coincidence, but you were thinking about pandemics before any of this happened. You mentioned that you gave a talk about pandemics and considering how we should think about them in December 2019. As we now know, things were just getting started. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about your thoughts on pandemics back then and whether the experience of this year has changed any of your views.
Yeah, so thanks. So in December last year, I gave a talk in Trinity College, Dublin, the title of which was something like why the future is very, very important. And one big aspect of that is, how we can prevent risks that are going to hinder, a great future where we're all happy and not sick. And of course, pandemics are, a huge risk historically. And many people, not me in particular, but many people who know a lot more about these things were pointing out that we were dramatically underprepared for pandemics. And unfortunately, a very unwelcome coincidence that while I was speaking, of course, as we now know, the virus was waging a war through Wuhan that was eventually going to spread around the world. In as much as my views have changed, they haven't really. It's only made it more pressing that what I was saying in December essentially was that we should be more prepared because these are going to come and they're going to be terrible if we're not really, really prepared. Unfortunately, that didn't give a great deal of time, even if people did listen to me in December. So the thought now is that once this is over, and hopefully we can end this sooner rather than later, the thought is that we mustn't become complacent about future ones. Future generations will face something like this again, and it may even be worse. Even minor percentage increases in the mortality rate or the infectiousness could make this a great deal worse. So we're comparatively, one remark before I stop talking is that a lot of people who are experts in this were saying things at the beginning in March and so on, that this isn't actually really bad, but it wasn't really bad compared to the scenarios that they were thinking about all the time. They were thinking about extremely infectious viruses with very high mortality rates. So comparatively, they're right to say that COVID isn't as bad as it could have been, but we should keep that in mind once this ends, and hopefully, like I said, sooner rather than later. We should keep in mind that this could have been a lot worse, and future ones may indeed be a lot worse unless we get our act together.
Let's not think about that too much. So want to talk about the decision to volunteer for One Day Sooner. All of you knew, you were reading the papers, you knew how deadly this could be. I wonder if you could tell me how you heard about One Day Sooner and how you went through the thought process of, should I volunteer for this? And how you talked to your friends and or family, more importantly, about that decision. I wonder, Zachariah, I wonder if you could start.
Yeah, thanks again. So the first time I came across One Day Sooner, I was actually reading an article, I think it was on the BBC news app. So through that article, I came across One Day Sooner, which was explaining the need for vaccines and how human challenge trials could be very helpful in this particular endeavor. And as a molecular biochemist, obviously this quickly got my attention. And having long been fascinated with medical research and general laboratory practice, I was taken, but I was very, very cautious, obviously, understanding the potential, the possible risks that could be involved in participating in challenge trials and in any clinical trial for that matter. But after thinking it through, I took about 4 days. I saved the page and I just kept thinking about it. And finally, I realized it was the right thing to do. I had to do it. I felt I had to do something. I needed to step away from the position of being helpless, from the position of hopelessness, and I needed to step into a position where I felt at least I was doing something to help the situation. And maybe the hardest part of that decision was, as you asked, the communication with friends and family. In particular, my mom, I took a long time to tell my mom about this. I kept it to myself for more than 2 months. I just kept the decision to myself.
2 months?
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, I know the kind of person my mom is, and in my head, I imagined the kind of lecture I was going to receive for making that decision. But eventually, we had to discuss it, and frankly speaking, it wasn't a pleasant discussion. And I understand her concerns. I understand where she was coming from. And if my child was volunteering for a challenge trial, I'll probably have the same kind of conversation. But I think something that maybe helped to soften things a bit was, I think part of her felt a sense of pride. I think she felt that whatever personality I was displaying here was as a result of her upbringing of me. So I think she must have felt a sense of pride as a mom and all that. And even now, when this topic comes up, it's not all laughs and hugs, but at least I can find solace in the fact that she realizes the importance of this decision. She realizes the need for people around the world to be protected from this virus. I mean, when you think of more than 2 million people dead, I know maybe it just sounds like a number, but these are actually families affected. These are human beings that have lost life. And at some point, really the question that everybody should answer is, would you do something if you are going to save someone's life? And for me, that's a question that I think helped me to simplify the decision. And if you are willing to help someone else, to save their life, then why not do it?
Danica, what about you? Could you tell us a bit about how you made the decision and how your family reacted?
Yeah, so as I was isolating and shielding my mum, when I decided and made that decision to move out, I realized I was in a unique position where, as a young person, I am so much more unlikely to die from this virus. And because I had next to no exposure, the likeliness is I didn't have it personally, or I hadn't had it that I should be a good candidate for such trials. I tried looking them up. They didn't really exist yet. Then Google algorithms found me a few months later, and one day Suna popped up and had an email address sign up sheet, which I expressed interest on, and here I am for that. But part of the reason why I thought about it, it wasn't just because, hey, I'm eligible, let's go. It was more, so it was hard enough just being locked in the house and not really being able to move and scared of the outside world. There's something horrifying knowing that everyone is scared and suffering right now. My best friend actually quite early in the pandemic lost both of her grandparents in 1 week. And watching what her family went through and the pain of that, and not even being able to have a proper full funeral because only a few people could attend at a time and they had relatives abroad. It's something that's so difficult. And after seeing that, it's not just about the people who are dying from this virus, it's also the people who are left behind, the people whose lives are ruined, the people who can't even grieve properly. I personally had that experience not too long ago. My grandpa passed away in California. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, I couldn't fly over, my family couldn't fly over for the funeral. So we had to watch my grandfather's funeral through Zoom, through the very platform I'm speaking to you in now. And that in itself is a pretty horrible experience. And I know I'm the type of person of, once you go through a pain, you definitely don't want anyone else to experience this. Every day, more people are dying, not necessarily from COVID, but from anything. And you can't rebury a loved one. You can't do it again. It's not like once this is over, I can go again and I can attend my grandpa's funeral. I have to be okay with with watching it through the Zoom. That's it. And I know a lot of people are suffering and they can't fully celebrate people's lives right now. And I want that to end. I want everyone to be vaccinated so people can travel, people can celebrate with one another, and can say last goodbyes. And I think that's important, as well as the people who are dying from this virus. So my family and friends aren't the happiest of bunnies that I wanted to partake in these trials. I'm not sure if they realize that I am still probably going to do it soon. They're on this now. Hi.
Now they know.
Well, at the moment, because we're going through the approval process for the dosage and characterization study, we're not actually at the proper official sign up, have a start date for these trials yet. So that's a bit that I'm waiting for. So it still seems a few months away, but it is something that I really want to do. And I think after speaking to my family and friends, and they know how passionate I am about it and how important it is to me that I can help to make this pandemic as short as possible, to get us out of this, get us as close as we can to some sort of normality. They've kind of realized they can't really stop me. I know that they admire me and they're quite proud that I am volunteering to do challenge trials. But of course, as people who love me, they would rather it be someone else. But yeah.
Yeah, I should say to those members of the audience that don't know this, Danica and Sean are, of these 4 panelists, the ones most likely to be called up in the near future, because it's not quite certain, but there may be human challenge trials in the UK in February, whereas none to this point is scheduled anywhere else in the world that I know of. So they're closer than most. Sean, I wonder if you could describe how you thought about the decision and your family reaction.
Yeah, so I mean, contrary to what some people who don't like challenge trials say, it's not that it's certain that challenge trials will help. I mean, I think all of us agree that they're very likely to help. In fact, a lot of us are still, I won't say annoyed, but disillusioned by the fact that these didn't happen much sooner. This time last year, perhaps, when a lot of people from One Day Sooner, even though it didn't exist under the name, and a lot of people were saying it back then. I mean, a lot of us here that joined One Day Sooner last spring were saying it. So it's frustrating that we're now in 2021 and it still hasn't happened. But the reason I brought up that first point with respect to how I think about it, it's what economists and other people call like expected value thinking, namely that even if there's a small chance that doing this, even with its risks, that would make things go better, would make the pandemic end by speeding up vaccine licensure and so on, or weeding out good or bad vaccines and so on. Even if there's a small chance of that happening, it's worth pretty substantive risks to do it. Nonetheless, I think there's a fairly high chance that it would help. So it makes it even more of a robust decision. But that's generally the mode of thought I'm in when I'm thinking about these things, or when I decided to do this last March or whenever it was. But I think, yeah, a lot of people demand certainty for any action in this pandemic and other crises because there's risk involved. But there isn't a scenario in which we're totally confident about an avenue. It's just frustrating because this is highly probable to make things go better. And a lot of people said we shouldn't do it just because there was some risk and there was some uncertainty. But unfortunately, there's always risk and uncertainty.
Yeah. Eric, can you talk about how you thought about the decision?
Yeah, sure. Like Zachariah, I first heard of One Day Sooner from an article. It was actually just in the local paper in the Bay Area. And so it happened to feature a former classmate of mine from Stanford, who they were showing as one of the first volunteers. And so I think right off the bat, seeing someone who not just is the same age as me, has the same interest as me, but someone that I know making this choice, it really puts the question front and center of if them, why not me? And I think, I was lucky that because of my interest in effective altruism, like Sean, I was familiar with this kind of mode of thinking of, everything carries some risks, even when we like to think that things are certain. And so we really do just have to weigh the expected cost to any expected benefit. And when you approach it from that point of view, even if it might sound a little bit technical and impersonal, I think it actually is a way of making decisions that most respects everyone's humanity. We can really be blinded by our own biases and make decisions that seem sound to us because we're programmed to just think about self-preservation. But if you do take a step back and look at the risks and the rewards, it seemed like a very straightforward decision to me. Also, living in California, we had some crazy wildfires earlier in 2020. And so we were hearing all these stories, not just of medical first responders who were on the front lines in the hospitals fighting the pandemic, but of firefighters who were out there risking their lives to quell the blazes. You see all these examples of people taking really sizable risks for the greater good. And I think we look at that and we don't question it too much because we know somewhere in our brains it's their job. And so it's just sort of built into the way that we think the world works. And it might shock us a little bit to think of being signed up to be injected with infectious disease because that's no one's job in the real world. We're not used to it. But in fact, the risks compared to something like fighting a wildfire are lower. Not zero, not something to dismiss, but we're talking maybe 1 in 10,000 is the risk of death. Even less if you're screened for pre-existing conditions. And so if you're okay with, your brother being a firefighter or your aunt being a doctor, it seems like it's a straightforward decision to say it makes sense for me to sign up and take this small risk for the greater good.
So I was going to go in a different direction, but I think at this point, people are wondering, like, why was there this resistance? Who was resisting? What was the problem? Why didn't they do, as Sean said, and like do things as speedily as possible at the beginning? Zachariah, since you are a scientific researcher yourself, though not strictly in this area, I wonder if you could explain to people why there is this resistance to human challenge trials with COVID-19. I should say that these are an accepted protocol in other areas where there is a treatment, and it's all, you know, if you get the disease, you can be cured, and there's no risk. So, you know, it's not like these things are wild and weird in all areas, but people were very hesitant with COVID-19. Could you explain what researchers and doctors were saying to oppose them?
Yeah, so maybe I could put it this way. Basically, when it comes to general medical trials, there's always ethics review boards that have to decide whether a particular trial can proceed or not. Now, the question of ethics, I think, is what I would say has been the greatest opposition to challenge trials, because there are many people who argue that carrying out a human challenge trial is not justifiable. It does not justify putting people at risks, right? So I'd say this has been the biggest drawback. But frankly, to put it plainly, right, this opposition, especially from bioethicists, is, for the lack of a better term, unfortunate. I understand that, of course, bioethics as a practice is necessary. It helps to protect human subjects and also prevents, unscrupulous individuals from exploiting others. But where there is informed consent, I think the curtain should be raised. Where an individual has understood everything that there is to understand about a particular disease, and they still feel that, I think I want to take this risk. I think at that point, bioethics should be looking at the bigger picture to kind of maybe really the point that Eric was talking about, where firefighters get into burning buildings. That's a risk, but why is it so easily acceptable to society? And human challenge trials seem to be highly, debatable up front. Maybe the easiest way to frame that is that when it comes to especially COVID-19 human challenge trials, there's still a lot that we don't know. There's still a lot that medical practitioners do not know about COVID-19. And this brings in a lot of skepticism, introduces a high level of caution in approaching these kind of trials. But also, to my point, I think the very fact that we do not know enough about the disease, which is killing millions of people, is actually more reason why we should study it. Why willing volunteers should be allowed to undergo this trial so that we can understand the intricacies of this particular virus and how to handle it perfectly. Otherwise, we just keep going around in circles, and the only thing that will be changing is the number of deaths. And this is what we have seen. We've been engaged in this debate for almost a year now, more than a year actually. The only thing that has changed since is the number of deaths. So yes, there is need to protect human subjects that are involved, but when they have given consent, they want to help. We want to help. I think the right thing to do under that frame is to allow for such people to help. Now, another reason that has been raised by bioethicists is something you mentioned about a cure or a rescue therapy, that there is no rescue therapy, so the challenge trial should not go on. But I think it's also important to look at it from the trial protocol point of view itself. There are a number of aspects of the trial that can be adjusted or modified to ensure that you have a trial which poses the lowest possible risk, such as looking out for things like the age, right? looking at for things like existing comorbidities or medical conditions. Looking at things like lifestyle. For example, a person who smokes probably shouldn't be the best person to be in a challenge trial, right? So there are all these aspects that are involved in the trial itself that can be adjusted and modified so that you find the best possible set of human candidates that could successfully go through a human challenge trial. Now, the risk, of course, is there, but the bigger question above the risk should be, is 20 people participating in a challenge trial more risky than 2 million people dying? That's the question.
Yeah, that was very well put. I mean, earlier this year, I interviewed a few researchers asking them that same question. And for them, and this was back in the spring, so it was even more the case, they felt that no real consent was possible because so little was known about COVID-19 at that point. There was a sense that younger people were at much less risk than older people, but of course they were not risk-free. So, and certainly in this country, doctors, researchers, the whole medical establishment is very mindful of bad, terrible experiments in the past, like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment is the most notorious probably, but there have been many others. Eric, I wonder if you think that because of medical research's spotty past, it's justifiable for researchers to have a very conservative approach to human subject research, or do you think that's just paternalism and human subjects should be allowed to consent and decide for themselves whether they want to take the risk, even if they don't know the risk precisely?
I certainly think that erring on the side of caution comes from a good place. We obviously want people who are making high stakes decisions to have humility when it comes to exposing fellow human beings to risk. But that said, if our definition of being conservative is trying to have the least amount of risk possible, we should think about that broadly and not just about the 20 potential subjects in front of us, but the entire population that we're trying to save, right? If our overarching goal is to save lives, it would be certainly counterproductive to say that I'm going to only look at this small group of people and ignore the knock-on effects to a much larger group. I also think it's just really important not to slip into the comfort of false dichotomies when taking these questions into account. We can often think we can sort all science research into those that have risk to humans and those that are completely safe, but that is not true. Even something as benign as like a psychology study that has people fill out a questionnaire about their own mortality, for example, there's some small chance that could be triggering for someone and they go and engage in some kind of harmful behavior after that. We can never fully eliminate risk. And so I think we just need to, be mature about evaluating risks and rewards when making these decisions. And the same goes for consent. I mean, if the standard for consent was that a subject must know with exact precision exactly what will happen to them when they take this action, no one could ever consent to anything. I mean, there's always some chance that someone, when they consent to trying on a sample of lotion in the store, is allergic to it and will die, right? But we don't say that it's not okay to give out lotion samples. So I do think that while it's good to minimize paternalism, part of respecting consent is the idea of respecting everyone's own autonomy and free will. And we'd be doing the exact opposite of that if we said that even someone who's educated themselves on the risks, we don't respect their decision and we're going to decide for them that this is not acceptable. If we hold ourselves to that standard and we just make sure that everyone is choosing of their own volition, I think there's very little risk of repeating the horrors of the Tuskegee experiment, where no attempt was made to educate the subject. As long as we're respecting the free will of people who are participating, I think we really ought to consider all the options available to us.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it sometimes feels as though there's a sort of really insidious clean hands thing going on where, researchers really want not themselves to be personally responsible for any harm.
Sure.
But of course, omission produces its own harms, as Zachariah and you have pointed out. I just want to talk, I mean, maybe a little bit quickly, because we're already running out of time. I just wanted to think about motivations in a more general sense in the backgrounds of people here, because Danica comes from comes from a religious background, and her faith is very much part of her motivation, her sense of duty, and Eric and Sean, as I said in the introductions, they're both involved in the effective altruism movement, which is a secular movement that thinks about and promotes a pretty demanding sense of responsibility in its members. I wonder if, Danica, you could start out by telling us just quickly about what your sense is of what difference religion makes to people's motivation to do not just this kind of volunteering, but any kind of sense of duty, because obviously religious and secular people both volunteer. What difference does religion make?
I think in terms of religion, depending on how much you practice. So my parents were quite religious, so every Sunday they take me along to mass. It also helped that the church was across the street, so don't need to worry about traffic. And I would go, and I went to a Catholic primary school as well as a Catholic secondary school. And admittedly, especially in England, people's faith aren't necessarily that strong amongst peoples. But you do get taught regularly and told that you should do your best to be as kind as you can and to love one another. So even if you do or you don't believe in the faith, that is what you are told so often, that you need to do, as you need to show in your actions and how you speak that you love one another. You need to be as kind as you can. And I think that really connects with the sort of motto that went around at the beginning of the pandemic of be kind. People are struggling right now. And I think, so some people, you know, it's quite easy to snap at people and get grumpy or things like that. Or when someone, you know, cuts you off whilst you're driving, you'll just be like, oh, that woman, like, you know, you'll get angry. And it's not, I wouldn't say that religion stops that or anything like that, but it does put that little voice in your head in the back going, should you do that? Should you not? If you get told something so often and throughout your education that you need to be kind, is that good? Then that's there in your head. So I think that helps with the volunteering process. It's what can I do to help other people? There are people suffering. I think there's a Bible quote which talks about when I was naked, you clothed me. When I was hungry, you fed me. And the disciples asked Jesus, when were you hungry? When did we do this? And Jesus replies, whenever you did it for someone else, you did it for me. And that's one of the sort of common and famous stories. And it expresses how the faith should work towards social justice and how that's how you should live your life.
So can I ask you, I mean, when we were talking beforehand, you said that the experience of this year or last year tested your faith. Could you tell us why?
I think, so following my philosophy background, God is described as someone who is omnibenevolent, so all loving, and omnipotent, all powerful. And looking around and looking at the people who aren't following COVID restrictions and don't care and just want to have fun or just want to go down to the pub and risking other people's lives for that pint, it it makes you search for the love and the kindness in the world. And watching so many people die and so many people suffer, and it's sort of being unrelenting. It's an ongoing pain. It's not like it's just something bad happens and it moves on. Watching all this happen, it makes you think, well, where is God in all this? Where is, if he's all powerful, why is he letting this happen? If he's all loving, why would he give people pain after pain after pain? And that in itself is something that I've struggled with, and I'm still struggling with. Each time you see people, so as I travel to volunteer for the homeless, I'd go help provide food for the people who are there. And at the moment, no one is supposed to be leaving the house unless it's essential in the UK. But I'll walk out of the centre, travel home, and I'll see people in huge groups just chatting and walking around. I've seen buskers in the streets and a huge crowd around them, and it's a lack of care. And I think it is very lucky and very good for that some people have not experienced the pain because of this pandemic. But it doesn't mean they can forget that there are people who are suffering. Yeah, and I think that sort of, I'd like to think that everyone does have that innate sense of wanting to do good for others or putting others before themselves, but it's hard to see right now. Yeah.
Yeah, that is true. I was going to say, especially in this country, but probably I'm wrong about that. Sean, I wonder if you could tell, I mean, you come, well, I don't know anything about your religious background. We didn't talk about that, but I know that you, since you were the co-founder of Effective Altruism Ireland, that way of thinking has very much informed your sense of duty. I was wondering if you could explain, I don't know if the audience will know what effective altruism is. Could you just explain what its basic principles are? And also I'm curious about your decision, how it jives with your decision to volunteer, because, suppose you were to die and therefore lose the ability to help for the rest of your life. Like, does volunteering for one day sooner comport with the principles of effective altruism or not?
Yeah, sure. So I'll say something very briefly about what it is for those who aren't familiar. I mean, fairly simple at its core. It's just the idea that, that you should, a lot of us want to help people, and it just turns out that there's like ways in which you can help people that are much more helpful, as it were. And that also applies to like choosing which causes to focus on. So like if you care about animals, a lot of people care about dogs the most, but a lot of people just care about animals more generally. They say things like, I'm an animal lover, but it just turns out that like most of the animals that need help are in factory farms and so on, right? So it's just like a very simple example to show how you combine the effectiveness bit and the altruism bit, and this general concern with this kind of like methodological concern about how you go about helping to the maximum extent. And then as to the question of how this kind of gels with the decision to volunteer for Human Challenge Trial. I mean, one concept is like the low-hanging fruit, which opportunities are kind of available to you at a given time. And, my comparative ability to help people during the pandemic is like much less than, say, Zachariah's or anyone else trained in medical sciences or who are medical doctors, for instance, and so on. I'm a philosophy student, so according to most people, including my parents, I'm useless, right? So like, it's not really clear what I should do. But then it turns out there's these trials, and thankfully I'm young, and I presume I'm healthy. So like, there's this opportunity to help people, which my education seemingly doesn't really provide, and so on. And my situation, I wish I had a lot of money to give away, but unfortunately, as a graduate student, I don't. So yeah, this just seemed like a no-brainer to me. This just seemed like this is the way in which I can help, and it doesn't seem like a whole lot of other options right now. And the risk is, I mean, you mentioned dying and how that would gel with my future ability to help. Yeah, that obviously comes to mind, but the risk is like relatively low. And it also rests on the assumption that, you know, I don't know what I'm going to be like and how my beliefs and so on are going to change in the coming years. But at this moment, I know that I value helping as much people as possible, and that this is like a relatively low risk way of doing it compared to, I don't know, much more extreme forms of research that we wouldn't allow or something.
Yeah. Okay, we're almost at the point where I'm going to start taking questions from the audience. But before we do that, there's a really important issue, which I mentioned in the introduction that we have to get to, which is the question of vaccine inequity. You know, as people may know, even in advance of their being publicly available, certain countries, Canada, weirdly, is the worst offender here. So we can dislike Canada for once. But also the US, EU countries have been buying up so many doses that they could vaccinate their own populations many times over. In Canada, I think it's like 6 times over, which obviously leaves very few doses for the rest of the world. And Zachariah, I know this is a subject that you care a lot about. I was wondering if you could just give us a few thoughts about how you think this should be addressed, who should be addressing it, you know, either institutions, people, which people, and, you know, what kinds of arguments can be made to change things. I mean, you can make arguments about inequity and justice, but as an article in the New York Times pointed out yesterday, there is also an enormous self-interest argument to be made in vaccinating the whole world. So I wonder if you could just tell us a bit about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So I think the first part maybe to highlight is that obviously this is not shocking. It's sad, but not shocking, because I think many people predicted this kind of pattern would unfold once the vaccines became available. And I think even at the point where one day sooner was starting from, this was a real possibility that once vaccines are ready, the rich, the powerful, the wealthy are going to jump ahead of the line and get as many of the vaccines as possible, leaving the weak, the poor, the vulnerable with nothing. And this is something that has unfolded so perfectly like a script. And what does that point to? It points to the ever-present inequality. That's why vaccine equity is something that should concern everyone. Now, in terms of who should do what to try and rectify the situation, maybe to begin with, if the World Health Organization took a more proactive role in ensuring that it regulates, let's say, pharma companies in terms of how much pre-orders should one country have. As you've mentioned the example of Canada, where they've pre-ordered vaccine that would vaccinate their whole population 5 or 6 times over, while there are countries where people are dying and there's still no idea when the first dose is going to arrive. There must be some regulation there to try and, you know, stop this kind of, you know, nationalistic tendencies. But also beyond institutions like World Health Organization, I think it is important that even individuals like ourselves should get involved. If something's not right, it's not right. Even if you are sitting in America, does it make you feel great that the country has ordered 5 times over the vaccine that you require while there are people dying in other parts of the world? Is it a sense of what? Accomplishment? I think everyone, even if we don't have the power to make policy change, our voices do matter, and all of us should be speaking the same language. If lives are equal, then the vaccine access should equally be fairly distributed. It should be equal. This is something very important, and I think this is part of the reason why human challenge trials have been pushed even beyond the point where we've got vaccines in circulation right now. without human challenge trials, it means that these 3, 4, 5 vaccines that are in circulation, they will continue to dominate the market. Meanwhile, they've got bottlenecks in production, in manufacturing. Right now, even countries in Europe, they are complaining because they are still waiting for the doses they ordered to be delivered. So this is something that human challenge trials could step into quickly, test the efficacy and safety of those vaccines still in production, so that once we have enough vaccines, at least we have a shot at ensuring that everyone in the world has an equal, fair access to these vaccines. I have more, but I'm looking at the time.
Yeah. Okay, I just wanted to, because this has been so relentlessly gloomy, that I wanted to end this part of it with Eric, because when we were talking, I was asking him about his thoughts coming out of 2020, what he's seen of humans and governments in that time. And he said he was actually optimistic coming out of 2020 that, Eric, you said that you thought that, unlikely as it sounds, in the long run, COVID may end up saving more lives than it cost. Could you explain why you think that?
Sure. First of all, the last thing I want to do is minimize just how horrible last year was and how hard the path to come is. I mean, I know a lot of us were sort of counting down to January 1st so that we could turn the page on last year and start anew, but obviously viruses don't respect the Gregorian calendar, and we should really make sure that we are not forgetting that this is still very much a crisis. But that being said, I think history is full of examples of times when humanity, after facing hardship on a large scale, has been reminded that we are all in this together, and been able to depart, if temporarily, from this idea that the thing to do is to sort of respect individualism and every person for themselves. Here in the U.S. After World War II, for example, I mean, not only did internationally we have the United Nations founding, but here in our country we had the GI Bill. We had this boom in innovation from all of the scientific advancements that were happening due to the war. And while those advancements were not distributed equally or equitably through society, it was a moment when we realized that we could really accomplish a lot if we look out for each other. And so I don't think it is at all set in stone that we will learn the right lessons here. People like Zachariah, who study these things, are familiar with the cycle of panic and neglect, where we invest way too many resources when the problem is salient, and then start neglecting it as soon as it's not in front of our brain. But as Sean was saying earlier, a pandemic like this has a lot of room for it to be a lot worse. And if COVID can be the one that teaches us that we need to monitor disease vectors, this is like factory farms where diseases are likely to hop from animals to humans. If it convinces us that we need to bolster the healthcare systems of countries that aren't as rich, because it turns out that when they are in crisis, that crisis can spill over borders. There's a chance that we can organize the world in a way where when a worse threat comes, we are better prepared. And by having gone through this horrible experience, we're saving countless more lives in the long run. One of the sort of core ideas in effective altruism right now, especially, is this idea of long-termism. And it's basically just a very simple realization that the future is much bigger than the present. For every one person that is alive today, there are, at minimum 100 other human beings that probably will live in the future. And so it turns out that if we're trying to just think about the effect of our actions and whether they're good or bad, most of the good or bad happens a long time from now. And that's a very scary thought. It means that we should be very careful to do things that might have long run costs. But I think if we're intentional about it, it's a very hopeful thought, because it means no matter how hard the present is, if we're learning the right lessons, if we're making sure that we're carving a path towards a more safe and equitable future, in the long run, this moment will be one that is net positive. So I think that takes a lot of work, and that's why I'm very animated to actively invest in making sure that we learn these right lessons. But I think there's enough people around the world, including inspiring people like my fellow panelists here, that we have a shot at getting it right.
Okay, thank you. And it's interesting that you brought up that last point about the importance of the future, because when I was talking to Sean beforehand, he said that once you present that argument, almost everyone immedially says, yes, of course, that is true, except for philosophers. Apparently philosophers resist that strenuously. So, if you want to work on that, those are the people to aim your criticisms at. So a question from the audience, someone says, did anyone in your immediate circle try to talk you out of doing the challenge trial? And if so, how do you weigh obligations you might have felt towards your immediate family and friends versus a more broad obligation? Just anyone who wants to answer that, if you can raise your hand or just jump in.
Yeah, I think for me, it's something that acted as a trigger. Like I mentioned earlier on, when I had seen the article, I read and I got very interested, but I took about 4 days just thinking it over. And finally, I thought there was the right thing to do. And I signed up on one day soon as web page. And the trigger for me was I couldn't answer just one simple question. What would I do if my mom got infected? Because I think sometimes it's very easy for us to think about problems when we are not part of the problem. We think, oh, there's COVID, or such a person got it. But imagine that someone that you really care about, imagine someone who's your family member gets COVID. What would you not be willing to do? And I think that for me was the trigger, and it actually made the decision easier. And I think it also was very helpful when I engaged with my mom in that conversation, which was very unpleasant for the most part. But I think the realization was how also coming to terms with the fact that I couldn't bear the possibility of her getting infected and potentially dying if there was something I could have done about it. Now, this is maybe a responsibility that maybe would be calculated only in the nuclear family sense. But if you've grown up in a setup like I have grown up in Africa, where everybody's each other's keeper, where people share food, your neighbors are more like your family. I think there's a higher sense of community responsibility where I've grown up. And that's why it's not strange that even a stranger who comes to you can call him uncle, An older woman who comes to you can easily call her mom, because we grew up and were brought up in that kind of system. So that community responsibility, I think, justifies and also made it easy to explain this decision to even people who are opposing, like my mom.
Did anyone else have somebody who really pushed back, or did people just accept it, knowing who you were? No. Let me ask another question then. There's another good question. And to some extent, Danica, you addressed this already, but someone says, I was wondering if you could say something about how you navigate feelings of disappointment and frustration at people who might not be doing their part to limit the spread of the pandemic, COVID deniers and so forth, or, as Danica said, just people who want a beer. Are you frustrated? How do you think about that in contrast to what you're willing to do? So someone who's not Danica, how have you dealt with that? Because you already spoke to it.
I'll jump in, if that's all right. So, yeah, it is an interesting phenomenon, because on the one hand, we all know how difficult social isolation has been. Though in early March last year, I was feeling fairly proud of myself because it wasn't too difficult in the first couple of weeks. But now, a year later, and now my resilience is certainly starting to strain. So on the one hand, I understand people's frustration. But nonetheless, it is, frustrating to watch them. I mean, a few weeks ago, someone across the road from me had a party. I could hear them. So over and above my annoyance at being kept awake at 4 a.m. was a further annoyance that they're likely spreading cases and so on and so on. I mean, one way to get around it is just to, think about solutions rather than getting annoyed at your neighbors and so on. Although that is tempting, of course, when, as Danica said, we're all tempted sometimes to get frustrated and angry and so on. But nonetheless, I mean, the same thing goes for the bioethicists that Zachariah was talking about. On the one hand, it's frustrating to watch them stand in the way of potentially really valuable research. But on the other, it's not really their fault. So they might get in trouble if they allow research to go ahead that harms someone, right? There's like this incentive to like always err in, against the risky option. But like there's no kind of feedback for when they don't allow something to happen that could have been really valuable. So like we don't say the people that have died that could have been saved is on like the hands of the bioethicists. And that might be too harsh, but we have to put structures in place to incentivize the right behavior. So we can't really blame the individuals when they act on whatever incentives there are for them to act, right? So when ordinary people just go and drink because there's no one there to stop them because the enforcement rules are really bad. I prefer to hone my attention on like the higher order things like government and so on, rather than on particular people who are just kind of acting in the ways that they're being allowed to act. At least that's how I frame it internally.
I mean, so taking on from that, does anyone think that there should have been, I only really know what's been happening here, but there's been no enforcement really in the actions of everyday people. I mean, when you drive around New York, there are these signs saying, quarantine for, 10 days or 2 weeks when you come to New York from somewhere where the rate is higher. Does anyone do that? No idea. Do people think there should have been more enforcement in the behavior of everyday people?
Yeah, I certainly do. I think when I was talking earlier about false dichotomies, this idea of like individual autonomy here in the US, I think is one of the more insidious ways in which that manifests. We like to sort government actions into like, you can do it if it's legitimate, as long as you don't impede individual liberty, and then you can't do it. But the fact is that all of us share a planet. And so all of our actions are affecting other people constantly, right? My decision to drive a car and put CO2 in the air is making someone else's life worse in some marginal way. And so again, I think it's just it's not really internally consistent to say, oh, it would be too much. It would be a violation of Americans' rights to, enforce with police, for example, a limit on the number of people in one space, because it also violates people's rights if, someone exposes them to a virus and they pass away or simply just confined home when they shouldn't have been. I would really love to see that kind of thinking from our government here in the States, especially, but just, remembering that it's not just the thing that immediately seems, least controversial, that ultimately is doing the most good.
I mean, Zachariah, what was that sound? It sounded like we were taken over by a demon. I hope we haven't been. You mentioned that the government in the Seychelles was very aggressive. Did they use enforcement measures that weren't seen in the US and the UK? And if so, what were they? And do you think that was a good thing?
I'm not sure if I can say that the enforcement measures that were put in place here were not put in place in the UK or in the US. But what I think refer to here is the cooperation from the citizens, the population. I think everyone, at least for the most part, everyone was really, really abiding and adhering to all the regulations that were being given when they were given. When the issue of putting on masks in public places, on the public buses, in buildings and things like that, when they were put in place, everyone was basically just following those rules. When restriction movement was put in place, everyone was following those restrictions. So I think it made things much easier for the authorities, because everyone wanted to do their part. And I think this also speaks to a greater extent on the roles that, or the responsibility that falls on leaders, because sometimes leaders can really influence entire populations, right? So because if the leader is not seen to be speaking the right message, you should expect that there are people who are going to take that, right? But because I think we had a very good representation from the leadership, from the authorities, from the word go, the briefings, the regulations and explanations, I think that made things very easy. So when the lockdown was initiated, basically everybody just stayed away. I know that there were policemen on the road in some places, but we never got any reports of maybe opposition or people causing trouble because of that.
Yeah, I when I was first talking to Zachariah, I asked him if there was any anti-masker movement, or anti-vaccine movement, and he was like, "What? No." It was sad. There's another question about an important. This is an important worry about human challenge trials that is not separate from the risk to the participants. The worry is, and the question asks, what about the generalizability of human challenge trial results? If you try to diminish the risk by only enrolling participants of a certain age group, which they have done, young people, how generalizable will those results be for the general population, especially older adults and Black, Latinx, and Native American communities? Danica, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, should there be a worry about that?
I think at the moment there should be a worry, but it's the best we can kind of do at the moment. There is a risk. I think it is a lower risk for people who are young, of a younger age. So for us, for example, the risk is 1 in 10,000 will die, which is actually quite small. That's not to say that we won't get other symptoms or suffer from long COVID, but we are still trying to learn more about the virus, and the more information we can get, the better. So yes, it is worrying that we can't necessarily test everyone or a whole group of people, but we're trying our best to get as much information as possible. So if that means some of us will go through it, at least the risk is 1 in 10,000. To do it for a whole range of people and variety of different ages means another. So I don't think at the moment that they are going to be discriminating against different races. So they will be looking and taking in whomever they can get. But obviously it needs different countries to do to partake in challenge trials, not just the UK at the moment.
And I mean, I should add to that a researcher I spoke to last year pointed out that even in the worst case scenario, that the results of the human challenge trials are only applicable to young people. That's not nothing. That's very far from nothing. Even if you had a vaccine that worked only on people under 30, there are a lot of people under 30. And they are the ones who are having those parties that are annoying Sean and keeping him up at night. And so if all of them could be vaccinated and, help take care of the rest of us, that would be very far from nothing.
And I think it's also important to remember that challenge trials are different in nature than a regular trial, not just that you're exposing a group of people intentionally and then doing what would normally be a regular phase 3 trial. Because it's this small group of participants, you can actually study what's happening to their biology and get information about like the early stages of infection, for example, in a way that you can't with a broader population. And so there's actually chances to learn more about the biological mechanisms going on that make scientists better able to predict, what will happen if we give this to a population with a different genetic predisposition or that kind of thing. I'm sure Zachariah can say this with much more scientific accuracy than me, but that's one sort of feather in the cap of this model.
Absolutely. I wonder if, just to end on a down note, of course, even if we do come up with many excellent vaccines, the problem remains that some people do not trust them. And, you know, this varies greatly from region to region, of course, but it's a problem everywhere. Anyone who wants to speak to this, has any of you had the experience of trying to persuade someone to trust a vaccine who is suspicious? What is your sense of where this suspicion comes from? Of course, it varies from person to person. And what would you say to such a person in a conversation?
I think the majority of the doubts and the pessimism that surrounds vaccines in general, I think have to do with misinformation, either active misinformation or just the lack of it, actually just lack of information. So people are discussing or talking from a point of ignorance, and anything we don't know, anything we don't understand, we always get skeptical, we always question. But more to the point, I think the general idea is that if research protocols or general medical research is public knowledge, for example, right? People understand that, okay, right now, either it's Moderna vaccine or AstraZeneca or Pfizer, it has gone through phase 1 testing. It's now going into phase 2 testing. Okay, now they're enrolling for phase 3 human trials. You see, people understand that, okay, this is how the vaccine is being developed. I think there is a higher level of acceptance when people are part of the process, either by being participants or by being availed the information that relates to that particular vaccine and its production. So for example, if I was to speak from my part of the world, most of the skepticism that surrounds vaccines is basically because of misinformation. As you already indicated, there are a lot of anti-vax movements that are very active on social media. And unfortunately, people are being fed this information and ultimately beginning to believe them. But the easiest way to debunk this is basically to allow people to own the process by participating, by making information available. That's why one of the efforts that One Day Sooner has been doing is to try as much as possible to make the trial protocols public information so that everyone has an idea of exactly how this vaccine has been developed, who has developed this vaccine, who participated in the trials for this vaccine. That way it becomes easier for people to own the vaccine, to readily accept it when it is given to them.
Just to add on to that, I think it's also important that there is an open debate about these things. With misinformation, it's so easy to be given potentially false information about a certain topic, and you'll only see one side because that's how the algorithms work. But if we have an open debate and there's a forum where you can actually discuss these things and listen to different people's opinions, then people would know more. There's power in actually listening to one another and hearing the other side. At the moment, we have such a polarized view that a person who may genuinely believe but just are misinformed that vaccines are not to be trusted, if they can't express that to anyone else and they are stuck with that belief. Whilst if they speak to other people and there are scientists available and go, oh, but I thought I read this, and then it can be debunked and it can be explained. I think that's really important. With anything with misinformation, an open debate needs to be allowed. As much as you may disagree with someone else's views, it is important to listen to one another.
Well, on that note, unfortunately, I think we are out of time to listen to you four panelists. Thank you so much for being part of this. And I know a lot of people will have learned a huge amount from this event. And I'm going to call on Michael again to see us out.
Hello. I'd just like to say that rather than find this depressing, I found it invigorating, because while there are many questions that aren't answered or answerable, at least you guys are talking about the problem and you actually care. And after a year of millions of people hiding in their hovels, it's just very warming to hear people discuss what might be a better way for humanity to move forward. And that was thrilling to me. So thank you very much for this. And again, Larissa, it's just wonderful to hear you direct such a complex and interesting conversation. And thanks everyone for coming. And I hope to see you in real life one of these days.